For just the 13th time all year, the Edmonton Oilers beat a playoff team. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we talk about the progress the Oilers need to make in the stretch run to the start of the NHL playoffs.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, we're going to walk through the victory against the Dallas Stars on Saturday night, more conversation about Stuart Skinner and the goaltender room, and then we'll talk a little bit about the balance of power in the Western Conference after the trade deadline, which we'll examine more later on in the week. We'll do a full Jake Wallman episode later on in the week as well. A whole lot to get to. Let's get to work. That game on Saturday night was a real fun encapsulation of the range of potential outcomes. And in sports, one of the real difficult concepts to explain to people, if you're not particularly versed in statistics, or frankly, if you're not that versed in just the logic within your long-term planning from a coaching or a general manager perspective, is trying to explain the idea of a range of outcomes. So the easiest way I can explain this is how likely something is to happen, whether it's win a game, win several games, win a bunch of games, or lose one game, or lose a bunch of games. Trying to get an understanding of what those range of outcomes look like. It's not the easiest thing in the world because, like we talk about a ton here on Locked On Oilers, we need actionable information. We need to know what's going on. And then not only do we need to have the games played, we also need to play a bunch of games. We need to look for patterns, and then we need to see if the patterns hold true or if they evolve more or if they change, because there is just so much unknown because sports, the statistics we have access to are descriptive. They tell you what has already happened. Very, very difficult to project what's going to happen going forward because there is so much volatility within hockey in a given game, in a given week, a month, a season. And Saturday night was a really good encapsulation of the full range of outcomes. You saw the Oilers rattle off a bunch of unanswered goals. Zach Hyman with a pair that he desperately needed. You got a McDavid goal. You got a Connor Brown goal. You got enough offense you got a star player goal from McDavid. You got two from Hyman, probably your best non-McDavid Draisaitl goal scorer. You got a freebie in there from Connor Brown as well. And that's one end of the spectrum. When the Oilers are humming and all four of their lines are contributing meaningfully to offense, to possession, to goal scoring, the responsibility of the defense becomes a lot simpler. In that case, all you're doing is playing no doubles. You're playing prevent defense. You're sitting in a 3-high look and you're keeping everything in front of you. And the problem with that is you get a little too comfortable letting everything in front of you. And very quickly, you start to let that other team get even a little bit of momentum, and the game swings on you. Dallas scores a bunch of goals unanswered, and then you're put in a very unfortunate position of needing to defend a tight lead with a good chunk of game to go. As anyone who has ever watched any sport ever, if one team has possession over and over and over and over again, it's a lot easier for them to chip away at a lead, to put a lead away, to get the lead back than it is the other way. Because when you're the other team, when you're the team that doesn't have a good chunk of possession, when you're the team that's on its heels defensively, your ability to materially change the game state becomes a lot trickier. It's a whole lot harder to score when the other team has a majority of possession because your chances are largely going to come off of opportunities that are driven by zone exits that are for reprieve. They're driven by a zone exit that's a rim off the glass to the neutral zone. You get one push for the offensive zone, you get one shot on goal, and then the other team comes back the other way and you're instantly back on defense. It's one of the real conundrums you face as a team trying to mount a comeback, and it's why I talk all the time here on Locked On Oilers about the impact of score effects, that we know when teams get out to big leads, they generally stop pushing offensively. They're a lot more passive defensively, and they want to invite you to take crappy scoring chances from the points, from the perimeters, because those are going to be very, very unlikely to result in goals against. The problem for the Oilers on Saturday was the Stars are a good hockey team, and we talked about this a lot over the last few weeks in regards to, in the NHL, every team you play is good. Even the lowly Chicago Blackhawks, if you give them chances, eventually even the Blackhawks are going to score some goals. And the Stars, as we'll talk about in the third segment, littered with star power, missing probably their second best player now in Miro Heiskanen, and they can score. That is a team that plays with a lot of possession, that's got a lot of shooting talent, that really has one of the more high-end forward groups in the entire sport, and they're currently missing a few guys as well, which is worth mentioning. And when you have a game like that, that gives you that roller coaster effect, that feeling of we're right there and we're not right there, and we're right there and we're not right there. But the problem here, and why this game was so interesting as an observer, was that the Oilers got out to the big lead. At that point, most teams on the other end of things, they're not going to be able to mount enough of a serious comeback to make that an issue. Most teams, even if you're pretty passive, are not going to be able to score 4 consecutive goals unanswered, because traditionally speaking, to score goals, you're going to have to concede more defensively. To push for offense to the degree you need to mount a multi-goal comeback, you're going to concede more defensively, and that's going to open you up to counterattack. But to the Stars' credit, they were able to push very hard, and they took advantage of an Oilers goaltending situation that went unaddressed at the trade deadline, in spite of the protest of a good swath of the fan base, a lot of independent media people, and national media people at large that aren't affiliated with the Oilers, just looking in kind of confusion as to why a team that has 2 of the 5 best players in the entire world in Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl was unwilling to go out there and figure it out later. And you saw that to some degree from some of the moves over the course of last week leading up to the trade deadline. General managers acquiring players and worrying about the cap implications later. You think about the Toronto Maple Leafs going out and getting Scott Lawton, who has a year remaining on his contract, and the Leafs are going to be right up against that cap ceiling going forward into the future. And they'll figure it out later, because they understand that, well, we've got Mitch, we've got Austin Matthews, we've got Tavares, we've got Nylander, and this is the last year we're going to have all 4 of them at their current numbers. Sure, Tavares will take less money, Marner will probably get most of that difference, and Tavares absolutely could take a sweetheart deal to stay in Toronto if he wanted to, and it's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate, because the Oilers missed an opportunity, and in this Western Conference, which has as many as 6 teams I feel capable of winning the West outright, having a goalie that is an environmental conduit as opposed to average, or even, dare I say, above average, capable of influencing the environment. You know, you think about the Jack Nicholson monologue about The Departed, about wanting your environment to be a product of you, not to be a product of your environment. And Stu is entirely a product of his environment. And that's not a knock on the player. Very few goalies are capable of superseding the quality of play in front of them. And on top of that, Skinner's internal volatility and the fact that he just makes mistakes make him an easy lightning rod for conversation, and make him a lightning rod for teams to mount multi-goal comebacks. But we are going to take a quick break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to hone in our conversation on Stuart Skinner and the Oilers goaltending room at large, especially within the context of the game on Saturday. Be right back. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you, unsaturated fats to help you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. They're the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days, whether I'm at my desk working on the show, in the car, or I just need a quick protein boost to hit my macros for the day. They're a solid go-to. Or if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Wonderful Pistachios is a complete protein providing all 9 essential amino acids. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we walk through the very, very sketchy win Saturday against the Dallas Stars. And coming out of the trade deadline and looking at the lay of the land around them, it is very easy to, and frankly, I am there now. It's very easy to be worried about the Oilers' goaltending situation. And yes, this is low-hanging fruit. The Oilers having goaltending questions is not a new story. There's a reason they've been so reluctant to move on from Stuart Skinner, because they have been on that goalie carousel for years and years and years, and they've thrown money at free agents. They've traded for goalies. They've traded for tandem goalies to make starters. They've gone out and signed a 1B and a tandem to try and be a starter. And fundamentally, the goaltender position in the NHL especially is an environment-based position. We have this debate endlessly over in the NFL about, is the quarterback good enough to elevate the talent around him, or is he a product of his environment? Are we talking about a Tua Tagovailoa, or are we talking about a Josh Allen? And I think there is a world where you can win a Super Bowl with Tua Tagovailoa if you're looking at dropping him onto a team that is supremely talented. You could even make an argument so far as to say that what Jalen Hurts did this past year for the Eagles would qualify as a player that's a product of his environment, that has a tremendous running game driven by the best running back or second best running back in the NFL, 2 great receivers in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, and a run-centric offense developed by Kellen Moore. That really puts it in context, because Jalen Hurts didn't have to do anything insane. He didn't have to play hero ball. He didn't have to do on a weekly basis what Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow do. But the problem with that, and the reason it is hard for a lot of teams to do that, you need to nail pretty much every part of your roster construction to get by with one of those lower caliber players that's a bit more of a product of the environment, as opposed to someone who can materially change it themselves. And there are a handful. We're talking about maybe as many as 6 or 7 goalies that would meet this threshold the same exact way we talk about it when we're talking about quarterbacks in football. And when you have one of those guys in football, if you have Joe Burrow or Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes or Lamar, that's really the extent of the conversation. Over here in the National Hockey League, if you have Connor Hellebuck, Igor Shesterkin, in years past, I would have said UC Saros, but when you, Andrei Vasilevsky, Sergei Bobrovsky, when you have one of those guys who has the dynamic ability as a goaltender to elevate the team around them through their play, to make that big save, to steal a goal against, to swing a game momentum-wise because you just gave your team a second chance because you made an insane save, those are truly rare. Those are extremely hard to come by in the NHL. It's why teams consistently tinker around the margins and try and improve incrementally in free agency or in trades when they're talking about the goaltender position. You think about The LA Kings post Jonathan Quick, the slow revolving door, whether it's a Phoenix Copley, whether it's a Cam Talbot, if it's a David Riddick, they have alternated between a bunch of guys. You think about the Minnesota Wild and going from Philip Gustafson to Marc-Andre Fleury, and they've continued to try and oscillate guys in and out. Cam Talbot was on the Minnesota Wild. Cam Talbot's been on a lot of teams. Cam Talbot is a great immaculate grid pull for a lot of different permutations of teams together, but the point, by and large, here is that Stuart Skinner is a conduit, meaning whatever energy is being expressed or developed by the team is largely going to reflect what he does. And over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, with the team playing pretty poor in front of him, it felt like Stuart Skinner, and by extension, Calvin Pickard. You know Pickard, he's not an NHL starting goalie, and frankly, he's on the lower end of the backup conversation as well. But when you are struggling, when the team is struggling the way it was over the last handful of weeks, especially offensively, which puts more of an onus on the defense, puts more of an onus on the goaltending, it becomes really challenging for a player of Skinner's caliber to rise above that outside static, to rise above the environment that's being played in front of him. And it's not realistic to expect him to be a stopper. He's not going to swing games. He's capable of doing that on occasion, but you need a lot to go right to make that happen. And it's why I use the conduit analogy, and why it felt like during the playoffs last year, there were points where he was unplayably bad. And then there were points where he outplayed Jake Ottinger in the conference final. And by and large, he was pretty solid in the in the Stanley Cup final itself. You want to see guys be able to occasionally make that play. But the problem is, and I'll throw it back to the quarterback analogy again, are those glimmers of Jared Goff, of Jalen Hurts, of Tua Tagovailoa, are the glimmers of those guys good enough, of Sam Darnold, of Geno Smith, of Jimmy Garoppolo, of Derek Carr, are the glimmers of those guys enticing enough for you as a team to say, all we got to do is build the right team around him and we're in there? And that sounds a lot easier than it is, especially in football, where you need, 40, 50 players on a football Sunday or Saturday or Thursday or Monday or whatever day of the week Christmas is on. Hockey, it's a little bit easier. You only need 18 skaters and 2 goalies, but the threshold for the roster you would need to win the Stanley Cup in front of Stuart Skinner is a pretty high bar. And I think last year you could make a strong argument was probably the best permutation you were going to be able to put in front of Stuart Skinner around McDavid, Draisaitl, Bouchard, Ekholm still in his prime, Nuge, Zach Hyman. You had a really good core, really good secondary pieces, and you took a step back, and that's natural. You make a Stanley Cup final and you lose. Generally speaking, you're going to have a bit of a regression. You're going to come back down to earth to some degree. And when that happens, you need to find ways to mitigate that. And the Oilers have been a reasonably solid regular season team. They've been in that second spot in the Pacific. They got up to first at one point at the end of January before falling back down to second. And they're not a bad team. But if the Oilers are going to make something special happen, there's a lot of work to be done. And as much as I would like to just simply say Stuart Skinner needs to play better, that's not how it works. Stuart Skinner knows he needs to be better if the Oilers are going to win anything, and the Oilers know that too. The problem for them, and the problem for Skinner, and by extension all of us, is that he lacks the consistency to be dependable. And when you're not dependable, you are putting the results of these games in the hands of the guys in front of you. And if you play good hockey most nights with Stu and net, you should be able to win with this team. But because they weren't able to score as consistently this year as last year, their power play not as lethal as it's been in years past, that puts them in a position where Stu needs to be better. And so far, he has proven that he's not capable of getting his game to mitigate that offset. He can't get to that next tier up. He can't get to that level of not even the Josh Allen Mahomes. He can't even get to the Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud, Matt Stafford tier of quarterbacks. He's more in that Geno Smith to a Sam Darnold group of there's the occasional flash. He occasionally can play with a big gun and they go mano-a-mano, and sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. But that's not good enough consistently to make up for the Oilers' other deficiencies. We are going to take one more break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the new balance of power in the Western Conference. We'll touch on the East just a bit, but this will be a subject matter later in the week we're going to have a deeper dive into. So stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Are you looking to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whether it's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. The best part of Factor is taking the stress out of meal planning. The convenience is unbeatable. No prep, no mess, just great food in minutes. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 off. Use code LockedOnNHL50 off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code LockedOnNHLE50 off at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out here on this Victory Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we get set for the stretch run. And the first 55, 60 games of the NHL regular season, those feel like a bit of a marathon. Those feel like building a slow and steady pace. We want to keep our heart rate in that zone 2. We want to keep an even pace mile over mile. We want to be making nice incremental progress. We want to stay steady. We don't want a big gap between 1 mile and another because that's going to tire us out. We're going to burn our energy too fast and we're not going to be able to sustain the same even pace throughout. The sprint to the finish is very different. Because when you look around at the debris of the deadline and you look around at the new landscape that these teams are operating within, things have changed. You look at where the Dallas Stars were at last week. You look at where the Avalanche were last week. Vegas, relatively quiet. Riley Smith, I liked as an addition for them, but you got better there. Winnipeg went out and added some depth. Minnesota didn't end up doing anything too particularly crazy, a small trade with the Bruins, but the West is significantly better than the East. In my estimation, the only 2 teams I think that can win the Eastern Conference are Florida and Tampa Bay. If you want to extend a courtesy to the Carolina Hurricanes, sure, but the Hurricanes, very much like the Toronto Maple Leafs, until I see them go to a Stanley Cup final, I'm going to be very skeptical of them getting over that hump, especially in relation to where Florida and Tampa Bay are at. In the West, it's a fundamentally different story. Dallas, Colorado, Minnesota, Winnipeg, Vegas, the Oilers. You can make an argument there are 7 teams that could come out of the the Western Conference rather, and ultimately represent the conference in the Stanley Cup final. With so much up in the air and a truly seismic move like Mikko Rantanen coming back to the Western Conference, that really puts the Oilers' position in a bit of a tenuous spot. And I would say the Oilers last year were very much in a similar boat to what I said about Carolina, about Toronto, where, yeah, they could make a conference final, but until I see them win one and get to a Stanley Cup final, I'm always going to be a little bit skeptical. What do all 3 of those teams have in common? Questionable goaltending, questionable defense. And because of that, and look, I I should clarify when I say questionable defense in terms of Carolina, because they are a good defensive team, but I mean more so along the lines of game control and being able to drive possession meaningfully. But Carolina is a bit weird because of how they like to create offense, being a volume-based team. It puts them in a weird spot where it's hard for them to score in low-event games because they're such a high-event team. But in the West, it really does, at least to me, it feels like Vegas is the best team. And I know there are going to be people who are watching or listening to this who are going to say, well, don't you respect Winnipeg? Don't you think the Jets are really good? I do. I saw the Jets absolutely obliterate the Devils in person on Friday. The Jets looked like a Stanley Cup contender. They won all their loose pucks. They won a bunch of foot races. Connor Hellebuyck made a bunch of insane saves. But the Jets, very much like the Oilers, like the Hurricanes, like these teams who consistently make the playoffs, for whatever reason, they've come up short. Some of that is their best player is a goalie. And as a Ranger person, as someone who has grown up with the New York Rangers, I am very well versed in the struggle of your goalie being your best player because they can't score. They can't materially control possession. They can't put a team in a disadvantageous. They can't put the team in an advantageous position. The best a goalie can do is give you 0. You could play a 0-0 playoff game in perpetuity. You could play a 0-0 playoff game forever, hypothetically. And because of that, it puts these star goalies under extreme microscopes. And if you go back and look, the underlying numbers for that first round series between the Avalanche and the Jets last year, the Jets got shelled and Connor Hellebuyck had no chance. And that's the best goalie in the world who's going to win a second straight Vezina, had absolutely no chance. And then you're sitting there as an Oiler fan going, well, if Connor Hellebuyck is getting obliterated, what chance do we have with Stuart Skinner? And that's where the team around him needing to elevate him comes into play. And I think it's doable. I don't think the Oilers are doomed. I don't think the Oilers are entirely out of the conversation as far as being a Stanley Cup contender. I do think the number of things they're going to need to go right for them has increased. I think the Oilers really dodged a bullet with Vegas going out early last year, with Colorado going out early last year, and it put them in a position where they got easier matchups. And I wouldn't say easy because Vancouver was a good hockey team last year. Dallas was a very good hockey team last year. But they avoided Colorado. They avoided Vegas. And the difference between, say, Colorado, Vegas, and then Dallas and Vancouver, I'm not saying Jack Eichel is as good as Connor McDavid. I'm not saying Mark Stone is. I'm not saying Pietrangelo or Shea Theodore. I am saying that Vegas has enough star power that they can largely balance or even out the Oilers. And then same deal for Colorado, at least in years past. I don't know about Colorado this year with no Rantanen and how they've integrated certain pieces. I'll be very curious to see how the Brock Nelson fit goes. I really like that acquisition for them. Brock Nelson, I felt, was a really important piece for whoever acquired him, whether it was Dallas, who I had predicted was going to trade for him, and then ultimately Colorado did. I really liked the idea of Brock Nelson on the Jets because it could have put Nemesnikov down to their third line, and then that would have pushed Adam Lowry down to their fourth line and just elongated their lineup and given them more options. But right now, as we sit here, I think Vegas is the best team in the West, then Winnipeg, then Dallas, then the Oilers. I think the Oilers absolutely can get ahead of one or two of those teams. I do think the Oilers are better than the Avalanche, who I didn't mention. I want to see how all the pieces the Avalanche have added mesh together and fit. But there's a lot of hockey to go, and it's going to go in a blink. We're a month away from the start of the NHL playoffs. Most teams have in the ballpark of 20 games to go. Some have a few more, some have a few less. Buckle up. It's going to get fun. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out Locked On NHL, covering all of the biggest stories around the NHL with all of Locked On's best hosts. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow night after the game. I should say tonight against the Buffalo Sabres. I'll talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.